Hi everyone, I'm Birgit from Kobasiani. Welcome back to the Charlotte universe. Welcome back to this part 2 of making a Charlotte corset. If you haven't watched the part 1 yet, it's linked here. Especially if this is your first Charlotte corset, it might be really helpful to watch the first video first. Because here in this video we are starting directly into the sewing process. That means the fabric is already cut, the pattern is already adapted to the body shape, and we've also already ironed on the interlining and added all necessary marks. The pattern for Charlotte is available in all my shops if you like to sew one for yourself. The links you will find below in the description box. So finally we can get to our sewing machine and we will do some sewing magic. Have fun!
We are directly starting with chapter 5 now, so that the numbers are the same like in the written sewing instruction. I'm now pinning together the front and the back dividing seams, everything with the wrong fabric sides together of course, and especially in the front part I'm taking care that the notches meet. At the back we have also these notches here in the waistline, but this seam is much easier to close of course. I'm also pinning the straps to the front body and putting these two pattern pieces together with their wrong fabric side. I just wanted to show you, it looks like this. The strap pattern piece is now pointing to the side. I filmed this on my lining pieces, but attention, if you have an inside bralette, please don't sew on the straps now to your lining, we'll do that later. If you have no inside bralette, you can sew on the straps. Now I'm closing all these seams, each with 1 cm seam allowance. Here you see me doing this with my inside layer, but the steps are always the same. Now that the dividing seams are connected, we have now some front panels with straps or no straps for the lining and some separate back panels. Now I'm clipping the seam allowances. In the back parts I'm clipping them mostly here in the waistline. And by the way, after each seam I'm sewing, I'm cutting off all the thread ends. And along the front dividing seam I'm cutting more often, because this curve is much stronger than the one in the back. And like this it will look nicer when we're soon ironing apart the seam allowances. This is really an important step and should not be skipped. Here again you see me doing my third layer where later the boning will be. And for my main layer for the outside, which is with this hard, stiff interlining, I'm even trimming the seam allowance first down to 5 mm, it's half, and then afterwards clipping it. This makes sure that my seams are really in a nice and smooth curve later when they are ironed. And if you feel like your seam is not smooth enough yet, then probably you clipped your seam allowance too little or too rarely. But luckily this can be corrected very easily. Then I'm pressing apart all the seam allowances along the curves, always very carefully and only with the tip of my iron, so that I'm not destroying the shape which is now in the panel. Here follows my boning layer. The lining layer I haven't filmed, but here the steps are also exactly the same. So off to the next step, we're adding the boning. By the way, I'm using this plastic boning here, which is about 1 centimeter wide. It can be stitched on, it is washable, so for my purpose, perfect. As it comes rolled up like this, I just give it a quick press so that it will be straight. Then I'm preparing the boning for each place or for each seam where we will stitch it on. I'm starting here with the center front, which I'm drawing on my third inside layer, which will hold the boning. Then, when you're now measuring the needed length of boning tape, it is super important that the seam allowances at the top edge and the bottom edge will be without boning. That means this 1 centimeter space, which is parallel to the fabric edge, is without boning. That means the boning ends sometimes also more than 1 centimeter before the fabric edge. And the reason for this is that we need this space later to sew the neckline, the armhole or the hem. And I'm also marking this on my corset, so I don't get confused later when sewing the boning on. Then I'm measuring how long this piece of boning should be, and I'm cutting the tape with scissors or a tongue. Then, to secure the ends of the boning tape, I'm just burning it a little bit so that the plastic melts, and like this the tape cannot unravel. So this is now my boning for the center front, and I'm going to stitch it on along the line which I've drawn on my center pattern piece. This is what you see me doing here. I'm just stitching along both edges of my tape. Sewing on the boning, by the way, I've used a thicker needle in size 90. In case you're making the stitching on a visible fabric layer, please continue the stitching up to the fabric edge and then turn around. As like this, the small horizontal part of the seam won't be visible later. The following bonings I'm always doing pairwise, and I'm continuing with the front dividing seams. But the working steps themselves are always the same. I'm marking the seam allowance, which should remain without boning, at the top and at the bottom. I'm measuring the required tape length of the boning, like this. Then I'm cutting this length twice for both seams. Then I'm securing the ends of the boning tape. And afterwards I can stitch it on, this time directly on the seam line. And this is what I'm doing here. That's the first seam. Then at the chest area it gets a little bit tricky, just take your time and pull the pattern pieces apart while sewing on the tape. Then comes the second side. Then I'm doing the boning, which is along the marked line on the front side part. And again, I'm marking my 1 centimeter seam allowance so that the space will remain without boning. And And then I'm cutting the boning tape and securing the ends. And afterwards I'm stitching it on. Then follow the back parts. Here I'm also adding the boning to the dividing seam and along this line here. And later we will do also the center back, but not now yet. At the back dividing seam, the boning should only go downwards up to the waistline, which is here. Besides that, the steps are really repeating themselves. Also along that line here in the back part, I'm making the boning also down to the waistline only here. Okay, so now the back boning tapes are also sewn on. I'm just cutting off the thread ends of the seam, and then we can go ahead to the back insert underneath the lacing. So that's that pattern piece, and here we are also adding the boning, but in a horizontal way, 3 times in 3 rows, I would say. And that's my boning layer here with the Christmas print. And for the boning at the upper edge and the lower edge, I'm drawing in first some lines with about 1.5 centimeter distance from the fabric edge, like this. And here also, like for the other bonings, I'm leaving a space here where the seam allowance is. The same I'm doing for the boning at the lower edge. Additionally, I'm adding a boning line somewhere in the middle of this pattern piece here. And I'm treating this line exactly like the others. Means I'm drawing on the boning line and then marking the seam allowance so that I can cut this boning part exactly. And then I'm stitching on the boning. When you're making a charlotte without lacing, of course you can skip this step. Chapter 7 is another optional step. We're making the inside bralette. And at first I'm preparing the darts. Here I'm putting the fabric with wrong fabric sides together. I'm aligning the fabric edges and I'm putting the mark for the end of the dart along this fold there. And like this I'm fixing it with some pins or with clips. Then I can sew the darts with 1 centimeter seam allowance, and I'm ending the seam at the mark for the end of the dart. Afterwards I'm casting that seam allowance. You can do this with an overlock sewing machine or with the zigzag stitch of your regular household sewing machine. Here I've changed the order of the working steps a little bit, so don't look at the sides of the bralette now. We're threading in the seam ends, if you have used an overlock sewing machine, into that overlock seam so it looks nice and clean at the inside. We only have to do this with the upper end of the seam. The lower end of the seam will be finished later with another working step. Then I'm casting the lower edge of the bralette while putting the seam allowance of the darts towards the center front. This is what you see me doing here. Then I'm preparing the side edges of the bralette. I'm folding these edges twice for 1 centimeter towards the wrong fabric side, and I'm ironing this and fixing with pins. I'm doing that on both sides of the bralette. At the lower edge, you can hide now the end of the overlock seam in that fold. Afterwards, I'm stitching both edges. Next, I'm preparing the underbust elastic. For that, I've bought this bra closure, which I'm unpacking here. But if you've got some hooks and eyes at home, you could also sew a similar thing on your own. As you can see, my closure comes with a small piece of elastic already sewn to that closure, and I leave that on because the seam seemed to be very difficult to rip. So I'm linking now both sides of the closure to my elastic tape. For that first seam, I had to change my sewing foot to the one-sided sewing foot, and I'm sewing on that side or part with the hooks. Then please try on that elastic band under your bust, check the length and cut it accordingly, and then we will sew on the second side of the closure. This I'm doing here with a zigzag stitching so that the edges of the elastic is neat. As you can see, I have a small overlapping of both sides of the elastic tape, and I'm placing the stitching on both edges of the cut tape. Then we're adding the elastic tape to the bralette. At first I'm marking the center front of the bralette with a pin and also the center of my elastic tape. By the way, the nice side of the bralette part is now showing here. Then I'm pinning both centers on top of each other. Now the right end of the elastic should be the hook part with the hooks showing upwards. That's where the white arrow is pointing towards. And at the left end of the elastic there should be the eyes where the yellow arrow is pointing towards to, and the eyes should point downwards here to my floor. And I'm pinning on the elastic with about 1 centimeter of overlapping to the fabric. This is now, by the way, a view from the inside, from the wrong fabric side of the bralette. When I'm pinning now the sides of the bralette to the elastic, I'm pulling it a little bit so that the bralette, the fabric part, has got more length in the seam than the elastic. Then I'm stitching both together. I'm trying to keep the 1 centimeter overlapping here, and I'm sewing with a zigzag stitch so that this seam will be elastic. And while sewing, I'm pulling the elastic so that both has the same length. Now we'll sew that bralette into the lining parts. So for that I'm putting the bralette part onto the front lining part. Both right fabric sides are now facing upwards. That means the wrong fabric side of the bralette is pointing to the right fabric side of the front lining. And I'm just pinning both pieces together along the neckline. And to secure both layers, I'll stitch now here along the neckline. I'm doing that with a distance of about 5 mm away from the fabric edge, so that this seam won't be visible later. Now it's time to attach the straps to the front part. I'm pinning first the straps to it and then sewing the pieces together with 1 cm seam allowance, like we've done before with the other straps of the other layers. And then the bralette is ready. In chapter 8, we're starting with the zipper. At first, we have to decide to which side seam we will sew the zipper. I'm going with the right side, as I found this is quite comfortable for me as a right-handed person. But this decision is really up to you. To get the next step right now, I'm putting all layers on top of each other, just like we will sew them together later. That means here is showing the right fabric side of the lining, and on the other side we have the right fabric side of the main layer of the outer fabric. Then I'm doing the same for the back parts. So all pieces are now here in the order of as they will be sewn together later. And for the next step we need now the lining parts, which are next to the zipper. Along this side seam edge, where the zipper will be, we are cutting off now the seam allowance, which is 1.5 cm. And I'm cutting it off in a parallel curve to the fabric edge. Then we're pinning the zipper to the lining parts. And here we need to know the distance from the center of the zipper to the zipper tape edge, which is mostly for separable zippers 1.5 cm. This is later the seam allowance of this zipper seam. By the way, I've already shortened my zipper. You can look up the correct zipper length in the written sewing instruction, and I'm linking for you my instruction video on how to shorten a separable zipper here. This is really very simple, don't be afraid of it. So this is now the wrong fabric side of my back lining, and I'm taking the zipper like this with its back side and I'm pinning it to the lining part. The two rules here are now that the zipper tape edge is about 1.3 or 4 centimeters away from the fabric edge, so that when we stitch later tightly along the zipper tape edge, it is 1.5 centimeter away from the fabric edge. That is because the zipper tape width will replace the seam allowance on the fabric. The second rule is that the zipper beginning and ending is 1 centimeter away from the horizontal edges. And as you can see, I broke this rule, but I've only noticed too late when I was making the hem. And I found out that I wouldn't have the fabric to fold my hem to make it nice. And yes, you see, also an experienced sewist like me makes mistakes. That's totally normal. Only if you're making a visible zipper workmanship, like I've done it for the lemon corset, then your zipper should start directly at the bottom edge. Look, this is how it should look like for the regular zipper and hem workmanship. Here the zipper is ending 1 centimeter above the fabric edge. Then follows the front part. I'm pinning this in the same way to the zipper as I've made for the back part. Remember the zipper tape edge about 1.3 or 1.4 centimeter away from the fabric edge, and the zipper is beginning and ending 1 centimeter before the horizontal fabric edges. And don't look at my zipper bottom here, this is wrong. It should be 1 centimeter away from the horizontal fabric edge at the hem. Then I'm using my one-sided zipper sewing foot to sew on the zipper. As you can see here, I'm stitching tightly along the edge of the zipper tape and, as mentioned before, 1.5 centimeter away from the fabric edge of the lining. Then I'm pressing these seams. Here again, be very careful. The side seam has a slight curve and we don't want to iron that flat. So here are now all our pattern pieces, and while this side is closed by the separator, the other side is still open, and this seam we will close now in all 3 layers. So I'm pinning these edges with their right fabric sides together. Then I'm closing that side seam with 1.5 centimeter seam allowance here. That's my hidden boning layer here. Then follows the outside layer. And here comes at last the lining layer. At these side seams, I'm trimming the seam allowance down to 5 mm, and then afterwards I'm clipping it a few times. This I'm repeating for my boning layer here, and also for the lining layer here, of course. Here I'm pressing apart the seam allowances of all my 3 seams. On the boning layer, I'm now adding also the boning tape here along the new side seam, and here the working steps are also like in the chapter before. At first I'm marking the points where the boning tape should start and end, so that the seam allowance later is free of boning tape. Then I'm measuring the length of the boning tape here, cutting it and securing the ends with fire. And then I'm sewing the boning tape right onto the side seam here, which is already done here. I'm just cutting off all the thread ends. Before we really start into making the neckline, we have some preparations to make. And here I'm folding and ironing now the outer layer and the boning layer at the side seam where the zipper will be for 1.5 centimeter towards the wrong fabric side. And before doing that, I'm clipping the side seam allowance just a little bit, so that my folding is really in a nice smooth curve. That's now here the back piece with the side seam at the zipper. And again I'm clipping the seam allowance a few times, and not that deep, by the way. And then I'm folding it and ironing it. Here I'm doing the same with the main layer, the outer layer. Another thing to prepare is this edge here at the back parts, where later the straps will be sewn on. I'm folding and ironing this fabric edge 1 centimeter towards the wrong fabric side. And I'm doing this for all layers. Okay, so now we can start with the neckline here. From now on, by the way, I'm treating my boning layer and the outer layer as if they were one layer only. Here I'm pinning the lining layer and the outer layer with their right fabric sides together along the neckline, and the boning layer just lays together with the outer layer. Then I'm sewing the layers together along the neckline with 1 cm seam allowance. And again, I've made a mistake when sewing the sample here. Of course, the armhole and the other side of the strap is not yet sewn. Afterwards, I've changed the order of the working steps again. After sewing, the neckline edge gets my regular edge treatment, I would say. I'm trimming the seam allowance to the half, down to 5 mm only. And then I'm clipping the seam allowance. The stronger the neckline curve is, the more often I'm cutting. Means here at the straps, I only cut a few times. And here, where the strap is ending and the curve is really steep, I'm cutting much more often. This part of the clip is now really very much sped up because it was very hard to cut through all the different layers. And it took me really a very long time to do that. The next step of the edge treatment is, you know it already, ironing apart the seam allowances. I know there are fancy tools to do this, but I'm just using this wooden spoon, which also works quite well. Please only take care that you don't burn your fingers. Again, a very time-consuming step, but believe me, ironing makes the difference and makes your garment look a lot more professional. Then I'm folding my charlotte so that the wrong fabric sides of the layers are together now, and I'm ironing again the edge. Please try to iron this edge so that the seam line is slightly tilted to the inside of the corset. Like this, you make sure that the lining part is not visible from the outside. Now we'll understitch the neckline. So here I'm putting apart the layers again, and I'm stitching now tightly along the seam line on the lining part, and I'm stitching through the lining layer and all the seam allowance layers. And I'm doing this all along the neckline, of course. Please make sure with your thumbs, which are underneath the fabric now, that the seam allowance layers are really laying towards the correct side so that they will be included in that seam here. I know this chapter was annoying, as the next will be, unfortunately, but we are already making a huge progress on the corset. Just keep going, you will make it. Okay, so the next chapter is similar. We're finishing some other edges. So I'm turning around my corset again so that the wrong fabric sides are out. And next we will pin the armhole edges together up to this point here where the strap will begin, and then the back neckline with the center back together. Here I'm starting now at the center back with pinning my layers together, which will be closed in one seam with a back neckline. Here at the back side, where the straps will begin later, I'm treating my outer layer, the main fabric, and my third layer as if it was only one layer, means that they are folded together here at that place. Then I'm continuing with the armhole edge here. As soon as I've reached the strap, there's a rule to pinning the layers together. This point I have to explain a little bit. Overall, we want to have the seam line tilted to the inside of the corset, right? So that it's not visible from the outside. But here at this small straps pattern piece, this would be a little bit difficult to create without different pattern pieces of the layers, or as I prefer doing it here, with this little trick I'm showing you. I'm putting the layers now together so that the lining layer sticks out for about 4 to 5 millimeters under the main fabric layer. Like this, the lining layer is a little bit narrower than the main fabric layer, and as a result, both sides or both seams are later a little bit tilted to the inside of the corset towards the lining layer. So here at the edge you see a little bit for a few millimeters the lining layer, and the outer fabric layer is a little bit curved here or has more width. At the zipper, I'm pinning the layers like this. I'm opening the zipper at first a little bit, and then I'm wrapping the seam allowance at the side seam of the main layer, or here my 2 layers, around the zipper ending. This is how it looks like now. The same I'm doing on the other side of the zipper. By the way, here you can also see that I'm treating my 3rd layer and my outside layer as if it was one fabric layer only. Again, I'm folding the seam allowance at the side seam around the zipper tape. Then I'm pinning the rest of this side of the corset. Then it's time to sew. I'm sewing as almost always with 1 centimeter seam allowance. I'm starting here at the hem at the center back and sewing upwards at first. Then comes the corner at the top, and I'm turning around the corset with the needle in downward position, and I'm continuing along the back neckline. Here, where later the strap will be sewn on, I'm stopping the seam. Also, that area will be left open because we will later put the strap into this hole. Then on the other side of the strap beginning or ending, I'm continuing with the armhole edge, and I'm again sewing with 1 centimeter seam allowance. Here at the strap you see again my lining, which is visible for a few millimeters, so that the seam lines at both sides of the strap are later hidden. In just the same way I will later sew the second side of the corset, means the second center back side, back neckline and armhole edge. After doing that seam, I'm quickly checking on my armhole curve at the zipper, because this is sometimes a little bit difficult to sew. Sometimes one side gets a little bit higher than the other, and now it's still very easy to correct this. So when everything looks good, we can continue now. And continuing means again we are trimming the seam allowance. At this corner here between the center back and the back neckline, I'm cutting off almost the whole seam allowance, by the way, but the center back I'm leaving as it is with the 1 centimeter seam allowance. Then I'm also clipping the seam allowance along the curves. And as you can see it here, I'm also leaving the 1 centimeter of the seam allowance in the zipper area. I don't know why exactly. I guess I'm a little bit afraid of that the zipper tape will fray too much or something like this, and the curve isn't too strong anyway, so that is possible. Again, this step seems a little bit annoying, also the ironing later on, but I promise you it is really worth it. So yes, as promised, we're ironing the seam allowances apart. Yippee! I know, that's not the best part when sewing the Charlotte corset, but you will do it. I believe in you. Then I'm turning around the layers so that the right fabric sides are on the outside, and I'm ironing again the edges. So the whole thing looks already like a corset a little bit, and now we want to add some small boning here along the center back to stabilize it, especially for the lacing later. So I'm turning around the corset again with the wrong fabric sides to the outside. Like this we can add the boning on the seam allowance here. As we will add eyelets later along the center back, we don't have that much place to put the boning there, so I'm just cutting one piece of boning into half lengthwise to have a smaller one. Again, I'm securing the edges of the boning, this time also the long edge of course, with fire to melt all the plastic threads and everything. Then I'm cutting it in the correct length for the center back. And again, it should only go down to the waistline here. Again, some plastic melting here at the ends to secure them. And then I'm stitching these small bonings to the center back directly along the seam line here. Here at the second side you can better see the positioning of the boning, as the stitching is in contrasting color. So I'm putting the boning directly along the seam line here, on the seam allowance side of course. Afterwards I'm turning around the corset again, so that it is with the right fabric sides to the outside. And this is how it looks like now. Okay, off to the next chapter. We're making the back insert. This is only for corsets with lacing in the back, of course. So these are my 3 layers for the back insert, and I'm just putting the main fabric together with my 3rd invisible layer, and I'll fold and iron now the lower edge of these 2 layers and also the lining layer for 1 centimeter to the wrong fabric side. This is what you see me doing here. Afterwards I'm putting the lining and the 2 other layers together so that the main fabric and the lining are together with their right fabric sides, and I'm pinning the layers together. Then I'm sewing the layers together along these 3 edges here. This is what I'm doing here with 1 centimeter seam allowance. Then I'm trimming the seam allowances, but as these are straight edges, I'm only trimming it at the corners like this, but here almost completely. Then I'm turning around the whole thing to the right fabric side. I'm gently pushing into the corners, at first with my wooden spoon, then with my scissors, so that the corners are crisp. And then I'm ironing flat the back insert. Afterwards I will close that open space here at the lower edge of the back insert. I'm just stitching tightly along that edge to close it. This is what I'm doing here. Then I'm fixing the ready insert at one of the back panels. So I'm pinning it underneath, and here I need now the markings which we've added before. Here we have the center back marking, and the other line at the right side marks the edge of the back part. And at the top, the back insert is around 5 mm lower than the back part. So at first I'm pinning it like this from the outside. This is just to get the position right. At the lower edge, by the way, we have a distance of 1.5 cm to the fabric edge of the back part. Then I'm turning everything around and I'm pinning the back insert again, but this time only to the lining layer. Then I can remove the other pins which I've put in from the outside of the corset, as we'll only fix it to the inside, to the lining layer. So here I'm sewing on the back insert. As you can see, here is that 1.5 cm space from the lower edge, and I'm just stitching here along this edge here. And I'm stitching only, as I've told before, through the lining layer of the corset, not the main fabric layer. This step now is optional, but I'll sew here to this edge of the back insert a small press button. This can be helpful when you're putting on the corset and you want to change the lacing a lot. So like this, when you close just that press button at the top edge, the corset already stays in the place and it's easier to put on the lacing. But if you're not changing the lacing very often and you're just using the zipper later, it's not that much necessary. By the way, I thought about adding this press button only after I already added the eyelets, which you can see here in the clip, but this we will do officially in one of the next chapters. Now we are finishing the zipper, and here again I'm treating both layers here, my main fabric layer and my third boning layer, as one layer only, and I'm pinning the fabric along the zipper, and the fabric should cover the zipper completely. Here is just a closer view of this, how the fabric is covering the zipper. At the lower end of the zipper, by the way, I'm already folding the main fabric layer 1 cm towards the inside, towards the wrong fabric side. This is already a preparation of making the hem later. Here you can see that fold, by the way, because I'm starting my seam here at the lower end of the zipper, and I'm sewing in the zipper with this zipper sewing foot, and I'm stitching upwards to the upper end of the zipper. Then comes the other side, and as you can see, I'm stitching with around perhaps 7 mm from the edge, but this also depends on the width of your zipper teeth. Normally, when the zipper puller is pointing downwards, the zipper has the safety lock so that it won't open by itself. But if you like to add some security for your corset, you can add here a hook and eye. Next comes the hem, but I've got another little task in this chapter here, which we are doing first. We will attach now the layers to each other along the seams here at 3 points, here at the side seam and at these points here along the dividing seams, more or less in the center of each seam. And to do this, I'm just sewing by hand some stitches through the seam allowances. So like this, the layers are attached and safe and won't move afterwards. I'm doing this by hand, but of course, if you don't have any boning, you could do this also with a sewing machine. At first, I'm fixing the layers with a pin in the correct position, and then I'm doing the stitching. If you don't make a lacing in the back, you should do this also in the back part, also along the dividing seams. But now to the hemline. I'm folding and ironing now the hem edge 1 centimeter towards the wrong fabric side of the main layer and the lining layer, and then I'm fixing both layers with pins. Here in this curved area I have some problems folding the fabric, so I'm just clipping the seam allowance a little bit and then everything works out well. At this edge also, like on the other edges, I am taking care that you don't see the lining from the outside. Afterwards, I'm stitching the hem. I'm doing this by hand because I don't want any stitching line to be visible on the outside, but of course you can also do this with a sewing machine. Here you can see now how the seam between the lining and the main fabric is slightly tilted to the inside of the corset. Okay, so here I'm now doing my hand stitching. Another possibility to make the hem is to add a binding here, but this doesn't work with the hidden zipper like I've made it for this blue-red corset from the video here. As soon as I finished the video for this lemon corset with the visible zipper, I link it for you here. The next chapter is about the lacing in the back, and here of course we have to add the eyelets first. I'm drawing at first a parallel line with 1 centimeter distance from the back edge. This is going to be the center of all eyelets. Then I'm defining the position of the first eyelet at the top and the last one at the bottom, which is also 1 centimeter away from the upper and lower edge. Then I'm placing some eyelets along my line just to try out how many I would like to do and what looks good for me. This is of course totally a question of taste and design. Then I'm counting how many spaces there are in between my eyelets. Then I can calculate. I'm taking the space between the first and the last eyelet, which I've measured before, and divide that through the spaces in between all eyelets. So the result is the distance in between each eyelet. So with this measurement I can draw on the position of each eyelet. And of course all the marks define the center of each eyelet. And of course, I have to do this also on the other side, but here I'm just copying the positions from the first side. Then I'm punching the holes on each position of each eyelet. As you can see, I'm using this hole punch, but if you have none, that's no problem at all. Normally, if you buy the eyelets from Prim, they come with a whole set with all the tools you'll need to make the eyelets. I think the only thing that you will need additionally is a hammer. So these are now my eyelets, which come with a description. And perhaps this description is a little bit different to yours. So best is you follow this and to make a trial, of course, at first. This is what I'm doing here. When you use eyelets from Prim, of course, you can probably work with the tongue from the same brand, but with my eyelets here, I couldn't do that because the tool doesn't fit to the tongue. So I'm doing it like it is described here on that little sheet. As soon as I'm satisfied with my trial, I can continue now with the real corset. This is what I'm doing here. I'm always a little bit afraid of eyelets or these metal press buttons, and when I'm doing them, I'm always quite surprised how fast it is to add these to my garments, and that it is not a big thing at all. Afterwards, I'm adding the lacing itself. I'm using here a regular satin ribbon, which is 1 centimeter wide. If you're also working with a side seam zipper like me here, which is really very comfortable to put on the corset, by the way, you only need around 1.8 meter of ribbon. But if you don't have a zipper, you should consider using a much longer tape here, so that you can leave the lacing in when you're putting on the corset. Otherwise, you have to redo the lacing each time you're wearing it. From previous sewing projects, I've still got these metal shoelace endings here at home, so I'm adding these to my satin ribbon. Oh wow! Finally, the last chapter is here. We're attaching the straps in the back, and as a default setting, they have 3 centimeter overlapping into the back part here. So I'm suggesting you try this first and later can adapt it to your body. So I'm drawing on these 3 centimeter first, and then I'm putting the strap ends into the back part where we have left open that space. And with that line which I've just drawn on, I can do this very precisely. This is also very important, as it can be that you later will have to change the angle of this overlapping line. So next I'm making a quick fitting in front of the mirror, and I'm controlling how the straps are, if they are tight enough, not too tight of course, if there is any gaping, so that would mean I would have to change the angle of the attachment seam. But in my case, everything looks fine, so I can continue now. Here I'm now stitching on the straps, and I'm sewing right along the edge of the back part. Then comes the second strap. And then I'm just quickly cutting off all the thread ends. And finally, the sewing is over, the corset is almost ready. This last step is now optional. ironing the front boning so that it will get a nicer curve shape around my bust. For that, I'm just using a folded towel to have this rounded shape, and I'm ironing over the boning so that it will no longer be totally straight but will have a slight curve. And also at the bottom of that same boning line, I'm also ironing the boning a little bit to the inside so that later when wearing the corset, the boning is not pointing to the outside or away from my body.
Finally, we've made it! Congratulations! Whew. This was really a lot of work, but I hope everything worked out well for you, for your Charlotte corset, and I hope you've had fun. Please don't forget to tag me in your pictures if you post any on social media. I'd really love to see your Charlotte versions. And of course, leave me a thumbs up here on YouTube, subscribe to my channel, follow me on social media on Instagram and Facebook. And of course, take care and see you soon to my next sewing video. Bye!